Okay, so welcome everyone to the second in a series of webinars which is run by the Engineers Ireland Academic Society. I am Dr. Amy Byrne from the School of Civil and Structural Engineering at TU Dublin, and I'm going to be chairing today's session. So I'm going to start us off with just a little bit of housekeeping. You can pose your questions using the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. Please don't use the chat option for this because I'm not going to be monitoring this and your questions could easily be missed. So you can pose these questions at any time during the session. I'm not going to be dealing with the Q&A until the very end of the webinar during the discussion slot. So please, if you want to direct your question to a particular presenter, please do include their name. Or if it's just a general question or comment to the panel, you can also say that too. So I'm going to pass you over now to Una Parsons, who is the Head of Engineering and Design at IT Sligo, and she's also the Chair of the Engineers Ireland Academic Society.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Great to see so many of you here online for this Engineers Ireland Academic Society webinar. I can see there's nearly 90, 100 of you online. And you might just use the chat function just to tell us what part of the country you're in. It's always interesting to see the spread we have joining us here. So as Amy said, my name is Una Parsons. I'm the chair of the Engineers Ireland Academic Society and head of Faculty of Engineering and Design at the Institute of Technology in Sligo. So this webinar on remote assessment, creating, correcting and preventing collusion is the second webinar in our online series. Our first webinar in September was on virtual laboratories and we had over 170 in attendance. So we're delighted to have you all here for our second one. Great to see so many of you. It's all popping up there all over the country. A great spread. Carlow, Tralee, Boyle, Trinity. It's fabulous. So great to see you all over the country. The Engineers Ireland Academic Society was reformed last year and has members from every university and institute in Ireland. Our mission is to promote the professional development of academic engineers and the advancement of academic standards in engineering. Members can share ideas and experiences on career development, the latest teaching and learning methods, and the recognition of best practice. We're delighted today to have 5 guest speakers. We start by covering findings from the Academic Society presented by Irene Hayden. We follow with 10-minute presentations from Louise Lynch, then Stephen Burnley, and also Dr. Paul Young. And our final speaker is Brian Call, and we wrap up with a Q&A discussion. Just a big thank you to all the subcommittee of the Academic Society who organised this event, chaired by Dr. Amy Byrne, and also to Maureen McNiengasa from Engineers Ireland, Clyde Road, for all her support with the event. I'd now like to introduce Irene Hayden, who is a lecturer in the Department of Building and Civil Engineering in GMIT and also a chartered engineer. During last summer, a subgroup of the Academic Society conducted a survey on the impact of COVID-19 on engineering teaching, assessment and laboratories in Ireland. Irene will now present the findings on the assessment part from this survey.
Thank you very much, Una. That's a lovely introduction. And we'll start going through these slides. So again, Una, myself and Dr. Anne Morrissey worked through the summer on a survey. Michelle has been a huge help in collating information from the survey in relation to the assessments findings which were appropriate for this webinar. So huge thanks to Michelle from TU Dublin for her assistance as well. It's great to have another person on board. Just to recap, the survey was conducted on remote assessments, creating, correcting, preventing collusion. So the information that I'm presenting now just relates to that. The survey was broader than that. It was conducted in the latter half of August, and there was 3 parts we conducted. We looked at assessment practices in engineering education pre-March 2020. We continue then looking at what happened in post-March 2020 during lockdown. And then we looked at forward planning to see what people were going to do for assessments during this academic year. The spread of information that we got from higher education, lecturers and people in management was across 19 educational institutes. And it meant that we got a nice spread, even though we didn't get maybe responses from every institute, and they were quite, erratic in terms of some head of department. Not every head of department had the opportunity, I suppose, to come back. But I still think it kind of shows a nice spread across the country, and it's a good representation as a result. Even though there was a limited amount of people. We could have got more, perhaps we'd left the survey open longer, but we were time constrained. So the breakdown of people who did respond to the survey were about 70-30, academic versus head of faculty, school and department. And the assessment practices that are reported cover levels 6, 7, 8 and 9 in the Irish National Framework Qualifications. Just to recap as well, we had 16 engineering disciplines represented in the survey sample. The dominant ones there are civil engineering, mechanical engineering, electronic and mechatronic engineering. But as you can see, there's a nice spread throughout a broad range of engineering practices, which are disciplines rather, which is always wonderful to see. Pre-lockdown, educators responded in terms of the modes of assessments that the most commonly used were about 50% using a combination of continuous assessment and terminal exam. So that again, just representative of the sample, not necessarily how it works across the entire country. It was only really what we could get at the time. We also had about 30% looking to report that they had 100% CA, and then so on, a mixture of mixed mode assessment practices, including multiple choice questions, MCQs, and design, project and research modules as well. During lockdown, the representation of how assessment practices were conducted across the country changed radically. The majority of people who reported on the survey, 51%, reported using open book exams, uploading handwritten answers to an online repository like a learning management system. Following that, 11% reported changing to continuous assessment only. The majority of everyone else had a variety of ways that they chose to assess, in higher education. And it was very interesting to see what people were doing. There was combinations of MCQs using open book exams and asynchronous lab work with simulations at home. In-person assessments for practicals. Some had online proctored or invigilated exams. They managed to hold exams. Other words were depending on the module and the weighting of the continuous assessment changed and so on. So there's quite a lot of information there and thought put into how people were being assessed because the mode of teaching had changed once 19th of March hit. During lockdown, again, we asked if you used a proctored online exam, how it was done or what systems were used. And again, there was very few people responding on that particular question. Those who did respond, they may have had, 100% CA exams, or they, used a different type of assessment. So they were the not applicable group. And then the exam proctored by lecture invigilation was a small percentage. The majority of the others were not proctored at all. The actual software used or the methods used for online proctoring reported were Menti, MyForms using Microsoft Teams. The reasons given by management for not using proctoring software per se was a combination of reasons. Some related to technical difficulties they thought students might have, they weren't prepared for an online proctored exam. Others had financial reasons, and some proctoring solutions like Examinate had shut down during COVID, and they were equally affected. Globally, the issue was an international issue. So proctoring wasn't necessarily an opportunity that we could have availed of in engineering education because everything had happened so quickly. During lockdown, the timing arrangements for alternative examinations, you could see 75% or thereabouts of people reported synchronous time limited. In other words, all students took the exam at the exact same time online. So that was by and far the majority of people returning back to examinations as their primary use of assessment, during the lockdown. Following that was 20% reporting take-home exam on a time limit of days, and the others were quite small. If we look here at the method that people reported most useful, if you add up the percentages there, by and far about 80% of people reported that exam-based examples of remote assessment were the predominant one that people found most useful. And combinations of different types of exams, open book, using MCQs, online exams, using programmable questions and quizzes using WIRIS, a really nice, interesting idea there, and so on. So quite a lot of exam-based, practices. Looking forward to the future, in terms of what people were forecasting as they responded, we had 36 respondents on this particular slide, and 4 predominant themes were collected, and they really were themes. I broke them down into how people were going to assess as opposed to themes within the assessments. And we could see there, the first one, the highest percentage is 100% continuous assessment strategy. So that's a significant change in forecast from how people would have done mixed mode. 50% of people said they would use mixed mode normally pre-COVID. So that's an interesting thing to take out from the survey findings. Closely followed by that is the mixed mode assessment strategy, which would be similar to what people have been doing previously. 18% reported no change, which I suppose could encompass terminal exams, continuous assessment, or combinations thereof, and an 8% on the terminal exam strategy. The 2 predominant themes I'd like to look at in a bit more detail in the next 2 slides, because I think they're the ones we'll glean the most from. They may, in fact, alter the outlook of the next generation of engineers and how we are assessing them and their reflective practices, both from an education perspective and from a student's perspective at the end of this academic year. Looking at the 100% continuous assessment strategy, a lot of the time, the majority of people there are reporting to remove the end of semester 1 exams and switching to 100% continuous assessment for students. So it's a clean cut. Followed by that is people for non-graduating students only, again, just changing that for leaving final year students with an alternative type of assessment. And again, continuous assessment as per pre-COVID-19 and so on. So lots of variety there, but a definite change in pedagogical direction, in comparison to how we were before March 2020. Those who reported mixed mode assessment strategies forecasting for 2020-21 and how they will conduct engineering education assessments, by and far the majority were related to this slight shift in the dynamic and how we assess in engineering. So a terminal exam and continuous assessment, sometimes a 50-50 weighting, sometimes the weighting wasn't given, expressly stated, or increasing the continuous assessment weighting and reducing your terminal exam. And then the rest were a nice mix of modules, either 100% CA or increasing the CA, using MCQs to disseminate learning earlier stages and breaking down the learning and assessing it in shorter spurts, using practicals with online exams, using WIRIS programmable questions, increasing the CA weight, MCQs, or a mixture of open book and MCQs or other types of assessments. So again, lots to see there from that. This is the concluding slide, and just to explain what I have here is really the findings as I would have taken them from the survey. So generally speaking, as you can see, we have a mixture of examination options, and they are forming the predominant pedagogical approach to engineering education as we see it in this particular year. And using technology can help in the assessment processes. So we've got issues there, mentions of learning management system, using MCQs, randomized choices, WIRIS. Someone mentioned using Canvas, using Zoom for final year project presentations and so on. So there's lots of choices that we can dip into. Technology is going to help us out with that. Increased quality assurance observed through new methods of assessment. So this is interesting because it was a combination of what people reflected on and also what they forecasted. And again, the actual quotations are included in the appendices and the slides. Just to skim through one or two, 2 people reported that students couldn't copy because they were on a timed exam. They didn't have time to do it. The open book exam made students focus on application of knowledge rather than summary of knowledge. So an interesting takeaway there as well from another lecturer. Open book more realistic of the real world environment. And again, that's quite interesting to think about in how we are teaching and assessing and how appropriate our assessments are. Observations on emerging engineering pedagogical evolution Again, you can see the shift in the dynamic from mixed mode, where we have terminal exam and continuous assessment, to 100% continuous assessment, you know, for a significant proportion of engineering education assessment practices. We also have comments like, the nature of CA will have to be changed to reflect online delivery, which is a very astute observation by one survey participant. And increasing the CA so people have students, more time to digest the material and learn the material, and more reflective of student-centered learning practices. Then the last point in the conclusion is that there are significant outstanding quality assurance issues that have yet to be addressed. And I won't dwell on them too much. They relate to proctoring issues, verification of students' work or the integrity of their answers. Is it their answer? Is it plagiarized? Fear of students using WhatsApp during a timed exam and sharing answers, and penalties for those who game the system, because there has been relaxations in some of the ways that people have been allowed to progress or to carry modules or get a second and third go at modules in their degree years. So that they are the things that are coming through in the survey findings.
Arlene, thank you so much for that. Very interesting insights. Can I remind all of you that are here that you can put any questions for Arlene in the Q&A section, and then Amy, who's our chair at the end, will pose the questions in our Q&A slot. So we'll move on now, and I'll ask Louise to prepare her presentation there. I'd like to introduce Louise Lynch, who's a lecturer from the School of Civil and Structural Engineering in TU Dublin. Louise is a chartered engineer with a master's in structural engineering from the University of Sheffield. After 10 years in the construction industry, Louise joined TU Dublin. Louise was a member of the LEAF Teaching Fellowship, which researched assessment and feedback practices. Please welcome Louise to give her presentation on overview of remote assessment options for engineering.
Thank you, Una, and thank you to all the attendees who have put time out of their day to listen to us talk, and for Amy and everyone putting this all together. So I'm basically going to talk about some of the remote assessment techniques that I've used in my structural engineering course that I teach on. The two main areas I'm going to focus on are the video assignments that I've used technically a couple of years ago, but would still work, and then online quizzes and how I've utilized them. So firstly, the video assignments, these are final year structural engineering students. They were assigned to work in groups, technically maybe not so easy now, but to work through an exam problem and actually video themselves explaining the steps. And the advantage of this was to explain the steps, you really have to understand why and what you're doing and how you're doing it and why you're doing it. So they got a much more deeper understanding of the topic by doing this. So it was a really useful task that if you could be still managed virtually at the moment, if it would suit anyone's means. Yeah, I haven't used this year purely more because I have other assessments that I work through. But it also builds on those graduate attributes of presentation skills and talking. A lot of us aren't overly confident talking in front of people or talking in front of a camera, and these skills are always, building on these skills are always useful. In the quizzes that I've used, the main one that I've used in the virtual learning environment, the VLE, it was through Brightspace, and there's lots of different quiz option or question options. You've got multiple choice, and then you can fill in written descriptions, and then there's arithmetic questions. And I'm going to sort of go through some of the main ones, mainly the arithmetic side of things, because as an engineering, especially to final year students, I don't really necessarily like giving them the right answer. I want them to come, even if it is in multiple choice, I want them to come at it. So I like using the one where they've to just put in one answer. So this is kind of what the arithmetic question looks like. You're given numbers and they have to fill out the answer. It allows you to put in units as well, which is really handy, because I emphasize to students that if you tell me you kicked a ball 2, I don't know if that's 2 meters, 2 millimeters, you need to give me units. So this is kind of how it looks to the student. However, how I write it is using variables. So each student will get different numbers. So you can set it up in such a way that you can have a range of numbers, and each student is therefore getting a single set of information. The only disadvantage is you can only have one output question. In this particular, in Brightspace's VLE, to the arithmetic, you can only have one, based on those randomized numbers, you can only have one output. And that sometimes can end up being quite a complicated formula if there's multiple steps involved. I think this formula is 2 A4 page width long, so it's quite a long formula to get the right answer, but you can put in the level of precision and the allowance for rounding errors, so you can give a little bit of percentage range of acceptable answers. In this specific situation, I only let 1%, which is very small, but still, it's that idea of kind of going, you know, how close are you allowed to get, and then you can set the units. The advantages of the arithmetic questions is they let you set that variable range. You write the solution in using the variable references, like the M1 that I had there. The unit is, which I find very important for students to keep track of units, is allowed to be entered, and there's allowed a margin of error, which is very useful. The advantage of the quizzes in general that are on our VLE is the fact that you're able to have various question types, and you also get a lot of information from that. You can get all the statistics of how many people answered that question correctly and how many gave that answer, and it automatically grades within that virtual learning environment. In that VLE, the grading is automatic, so that's really helpful, and it speeds up the marking process if that's done. So the disadvantage is there's no conversion of units. So if you ask them if they put something in and the answer was meant to be 2 meters and they put in 2,000 millimeters, it would see it as wrong. You're only able to input one single set of variables, or one input. There's only one question for that, so you can only have one question related to them variables. And all the initial values can be set. So I utilized this quiz during my 2019-20 end of semester exams, and I chose, because I couldn't use the randomized numbers because there was so many multiple questions, I wanted them to give me the parts of the question or the steps involved in the question. So I ended up having to create multiple quizzes just so that there was some variability. So that was the disadvantage of that. Yeah, so and then they submitted the hand calculation separate, and just so that I could give attempt marks if they didn't get finished. What I've also looked at is the use of a program called Numbers. It's an open source e-assessment system developed by Newcastle University. It uses what's called a SCORM that you can put into your VLE. So you download it from the website, and you create it on the website, and download this SCORM and put it into your VLE, your virtual learning environment. There is an option to have this integrated into your VLE, but we don't currently have that. It uses a bit of, you can get quite advanced because it uses JavaScript, and if you know your coding, you can get quite advanced problems, but you don't need it to do the basic questions, so it's actually quite useful. The advantages and disadvantages are that there's complex mathematical questions can be done, on the advantages side, various answers based on one set of questions, and I'll sort of show that in a second. There's an integration with the VLE as possible, so you get kind of some of the disadvantages are fixed with that. And it is great for formative assessment. Some of the disadvantages make it a little bit more troublesome for summative assessment, but I have used it for summative assessments. So the lecturing, the disadvantages then, as a lecturer, you don't actually see the numbers that the student gets unless they go through this extra, students go through this extra step, which I'll explain in a second. But yeah, so you don't see the numbers they get, you just see the mark they achieved. There's no current option to have a written, a written box descriptive question, which for some modules that's not going to be a problem, but for others it will be. And sometimes for some unknown reason, the values aren't populated automatically into the VLE. Anytime I've trialed it, it does, but without standing over students, I don't know what they're doing that it doesn't. So it seems to be a little bit random in that regard, but that's where the first and the last will be solved with the integrated VLE. So some of the questions, so I just have a video that's going to loop for a few minutes, but you're able to see quite a number of different types of questions. They're all mathematical based. You have the quantity with units, you've true and false, you've select, match, you've all those type of questions which are very useful. But the one I'm going to mainly focus on is the quantity section. So the main questions, especially for the formative assessments, would look typically like this. So you're able to do steps. So if a student doesn't get a question finished and the steps involved in it, you can let them input the steps. And it'll let them know, in the formative version, it'll let them know whether they're right or wrong, and let them reveal what the answer should have been, and then kind of let them go through the whole process and get new numbers and try it out again. Obviously, that's in the part where they're interacting with it, and you're able to kind of gauge things. You're also able to set the units, and if they don't put in units, you can mark it incorrect because you asked. If they put in the units that are in newtons, it'll actually convert it for them and still say it's correct if you allow different type of units. So there I've put in newtons, and that's allowed through the process. So it is smarter in that way that it can do the conversions for you. When the interface, once you get used to it, it's not so bad, but similar to the arithmetic questions in the VLE, you're setting those variables, and then you just use sort of gaps to set it, and your margin of error can be a percentage of your answers, but there's an awful lot of variables allowed. I typically group them in the provided data, and then the different groups of the different type of calculations I'm doing, like here with the calculated lengths. And I'll scroll down through all the different calculations that were involved in this question. So there's many different calculations. So if I was looking for one final answer at the end, this wouldn't be able to be done in arithmetic. There's many, many steps. But you're able to incorporate the units into the outputs and into the answer that's expected. So I'm here, it says I want kilonewtons, but it will do the conversion if I'm okay with them using newtons, or same as meters or millimeters, more so. So there's a little bit of skill, kind of practicing required here, where you would go back through, you would have to do trials with your students to make sure they're familiar with the interface. The exam, if you're doing an exam on it, you can stop all those formative bits. They won't see when the answer is right or wrong, so don't be worried about that. They can't reveal the answers. But at the end, the thing is this print exam transcripts. It's very useful for your external examiners. You have a printed version, but you have to get the students to click that print exam transcripts button. And that's the big thing. And if you don't get that, you don't have their numbers. But if you can get them trained up through some practice tests, then you get that PDF, which is useful for the external examiners as well. So yeah, the main issues that come with numbers is able to be resolved with a few practice. Once they know to click on that print exam transcripts, most of the issues are resolved, and then they can send that with their hand calcs into you. It's a little bit of a learning curve, but it's not fairly quick learning curve. It's not too complicated, and the help out there for it is wonderful. But that's the main disadvantage of the Brightspace VLE that we use, is the fact that it doesn't have it doesn't allow multiple answers to one set of variables. Okay, if you have any questions on this, my email's there. Obviously, you can ask in the question and answers as well. So if you have anything else, I'll just pass on to the next person.
That is excellent, and I'm sure there will be a few questions either by email or in the Q&A later on that. I see there's been some questions in regard to copies of the slides. We are recording the webinar, so we will be emailing the link out to that later on when we put it all together. So next I'd like to introduce Stephen Burnley. Stephen is a senior lecturer in environmental engineering and deputy director of teaching in the Department of Engineering and Innovation in the Open University. Stephen's background is in chemical and environmental engineering, and he is responsible for delivering a module in general engineering to around 450 distance learning students a year, and is the qualification director of the Open University's Masters in Environmental Manager. Welcome, Stephen, to give your presentation on industrial scale remote assessment experiences from the Open University.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone who was concerned with organising the event, and for inviting me to share some experiences with you. So I'm Stephen Burnley, and I work at the Open University, and I'm based at our main campus in Milton Keynes. about 60 miles or 100 kilometres north west of London. And my email is there again if anyone wishes to contact me afterwards. I'd like to start by just reminding you about a few facts and figures about the Open University. We're very proud that we're the UK's largest university. We've got around 160,000 students, and most of these are part-time students. So in practice, that means we've about 63,000 full-time equivalents. I'm pleased to say that we have just over 4,000 students in Ireland, which again translates to about 1,400 full-time equivalents. We also have an office in Dublin, not so far from St Stephen's Green, which I have to say is one of my favourite places in Dublin. To give you an idea of our student numbers, our largest module, which is the Introducing the Social Sciences, has close on 4,000 students. And in engineering, numbers are somewhat more modest. Our biggest population module has about 1,100 students, and that drops down to around maybe 25 students on the Masters of Engineering final group project. The way we work at the OU is that all of our students are guided and supported by what we call an associate lecturer who acts as their tutor. And typically one tutor will look after a group of around 20 students. Some of our tutors are strictly part-timers with the OU. They may only teach on one module or perhaps two modules a year, whereas others have so many modules, in effect, they are working full-time tutoring for us. So that's a bit about the OU. I thought I'd go on to say how we tend to do assessment in the engineering faculty. Typically, for a 30 credit module, which equates to about 300 hours of study, we would ask students to do 2 or 3 summative pieces of coursework, perhaps some formative computer-based assessments, and then a summative end of module assessment, which typically would be a mini project, or in some cases we would ask them to do a traditional unseen examination. Even before COVID hit us, we were seeing a general move away from the unseen examinations to the project type assessments. And of course, in spring of this year, the university took a view to replace all the unseen exams with time-limited assignments, and that's certainly going to happen for at least the first half of the next year, and possibly for longer. So the way we work with our coursework, each assignment is submitted in an electronic form by each student, usually as a Word or perhaps a PDF document, using our in-house system. I think in practice, if we were starting from scratch, we would probably use Turnitin or one of the other Moodle or Blackboard-based systems to submit assignments. The central module team provides a marking scheme to all the tutors, and then the tutors will do the marking using the scheme and provide detailed feedback to each student. That's very important for the OU because for some students, that's the only bespoke teaching support that a student will receive. To make sure that the quality control is maintained, a sample of each tutor's scripts will be monitored by the module chair to ensure that we're being consistent in marking and giving sufficient and high quality feedback. All the scripts are run against plagiarism and collusion software, and the reports generated by Turnitin and Copycatch are sent to the module chair. The module chair will then review these outputs, and any suspected cases of plagiarism or rather bad academic practice, they would be referred to the school's academic conduct officer, who reviews all the cases. The reason we have one person doing it for the whole of the school is to make sure that they adopt consistent approaches, and of course that persistent offenders are identified and dealt with in the appropriate way. When it comes to the assessment system for the end of module assessments, it's similar to the coursework system in many ways. The scripts again are submitted electronically. The individual tutors don't mark their own students' assignments, but they do inspect the scripts to do a certain amount of verification, and so they can comment if the student has mysteriously increased their quality of their performance between their assignments and their end of module assessment. The marking, it's typically done by one of the other tutors or by a member of the central module team, depending on the student numbers on that module. And again, it's all done with the against a marking scheme which is provided by the module team. Before we start the marking process, we have a coordination exercise where all the markers will mark a sample of 2 or 3 scripts, and then we'll have an online conference and chat where we share marks and discuss how we've approached the marking. Once the marking's been done by each marker, the marks will be submitted through another electronic system, along with any comments to the examination board, and also they give, albeit limited, feedback to the students. Again, to assure consistency, some or all of the scripts are independently double marked, and wide variations between markers are resolved either by a conversation between the 2 markers or through third marking by the module chair. One other thing we can do with the coursework marks is that we can standardize those, so consistently lenient or stringent markers, their marks can be adjusted across the board to ensure fairness. We do also assess practical work. Now, I know this was the subject of your previous seminar, so I won't say too much about that, other than to say we use a thing called the Open STEM Laboratory, and there's a web link on the slides, which if people are interested in remote practical work, I suggest you follow yourself to do that. Well, my final few slides, I just want to give some advice, and these are my own personal views, not necessarily those of the university, of using remote assessment. On a positive note, I would say remote assessment can and does work very well. We can do lots of quality checks, and this gives confidence to the external examiner, to accrediting bodies and to national regulators. Remote assessment, you can do assessment both of learning and through the feedback assessment for learning. The systems can be transparent and highly auditable. For students with some classes of disability or illness, this remote system can be better than a campus-based system. And my final point is that, well, in the current circumstances, we don't really have much choice about using remote assessment. Of course, remote assessment does have some drawbacks, as I'm sure you're all finding. The setup time and cost commitments are high, and probably much higher than you anticipated at the start. we need to be very careful to make sure that the students are seen to be getting a good deal and a fair deal. This is particularly in the UK, where all our students are paying their own fees. To introduce systems, you need a lot of support, right from the module team up to the faculty and university levels. You need very robust IT systems, and there are problems with some students who have limited internet access, those living in remote areas, those serving with the military, people in secure hospitals or prisons. And despite the verification processes, there's always leads a question, has a student really done the work themselves? And that's something which I think one of our later speakers, Brian, will probably be addressing. So finally, to conclude, remote assessment, it can provide an efficient means of assessing learning and providing teaching support. We can incorporate traceable and auditable QA processes. Reliable IT systems are essential. It requires a high degree of commitment across the university. Don't for any means think it's a cheap alternative to conventional assessment. And as I say, the high costs means it's probably more suited to the large student numbers and to be something you adopt on a permanent basis rather than just for COVID. So at that point, thank you very much, everyone. I'll be interested to follow the questions in the question box. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Can you hear me, Amy? Yeah. Una here?
Yeah.
Okay. I'd like to now welcome Dr. Paul Young, lecturer in the School of Mechanical and Manufacturing Engineering in DCU. Paul completed his Bachelor of Engineering in Mechanical and Manufacturing Engineering and was later awarded his PhD for his thesis on the high frequency monitoring of cutting vibrations. As part of his teaching, Paul has looked to use the latest technology and has used the quiz featured on Moodle extensively to enable examination of student progress. Now, please welcome Paul to give his presentation, Online Examinations of Open Problems for Engineering Mechanics. Hello, Paul.
Hello, can you all hear me?
Yes, thanks,
Great.
Paul. We hear you now.
Okay, the usual one, you forget to push one button while you're doing this. So thank you for the opportunity, and it's been interesting to hear what's been said already. I'm hoping my presentation doesn't mirror Louise's too closely, because it's similar with slightly different technology, so the contrasts might be interesting overall. We use in DCU a branded version of Moodle that is called Loop. That's what the students see, and they log into Loop, but it's Moodle in the background that's doing most of the work. And this year, particularly for final assessments and for a number of years for continuous assessment, I've been using quizzes. And last year we finally got some advanced question types added to the portfolio on Moodle, and that's been quite useful. So I'm going to take you through some of those things now. But a quiz on Loop is just a container activity that you can then select a number of questions to go into it. The questions can be of different types, so some of the different elements that have been explained already can be put into the same quiz, so you don't just have to have one type of question for them all. The behavior of the questions can be controlled by the quiz as well, so sometimes it can act as formative and sometimes it can act as a summative activity for the students. And again, the presentation of the questions can be controlled, and what the student sees at any stage is controlled in the setup. I'm just going to deviate from my planned presentation because I have a couple of examples in here, and you can have kind of drag and drop type questions where you're just filling in the blanks either with different words or with different images. And for some of what I did, I thought drag and drop is a great idea, particularly for something like a free body diagram. But I didn't like the fact that you had targets for dragging and dropping everything. And I came across this one then last year. Hopefully you can see that on the screen, a picture of a bicycle. And I gave the question there, and this is the problem statement. And then further down, what the students get is a reduced diagram. And the idea is that they drag and drop just little target icons on here where W represents a weight in this instance. Below it there in the same quiz, you can see I've got to fill in the blanks, and these are free form text fields, the closed type questions. And after that, you can, it gets reviewed and they get marks depending on how many of these boxes they've got correct. But these are the particular on the image one. The bit I like here is this free form one where we're not giving them any hints about where the answers might be. And the other thing, I thought, let's give them more options for things to add on than they had, so they have to do a little bit of choosing. It does require a little bit of training of the students as you go along. The main element, though, that I want to talk about here, though, is a type of question that's been made available on Moodle, and I believe it can be added to others, that's called Stack. And sorry, I just skipped through this button as well because that's there. So here's an exam question as I would have set it. In fact, this is as I set it for my third year class at the end at Christmas time. So they did this on paper. And for the resit exam, which was carried out online, this is the equivalent that I have on the Loop quiz that we did as an online assessment. This was a timed assessment, and it was done synchronously, so everybody was on it together. I've kind of made a bit of a recording here, so I'll talk over the top of that. What I did with this was I gave the students a whole series of boxes that they were filling in. And because these students hadn't really used the system very much at all, I limited my answers to numerical answers and gave them the units here. Although we can, in this system, also have them have to enter the units. The advantage of this over some of the other systems that we've seen is that I'm able to assess subsequent answers on the basis perhaps of miscalculations that the students have already done in the early parts of the questions. And here I'm only allowing them to type in numbers, so it's evaluating that, and it gives the student feedbacks on how the system is interpreting the numbers before they do anything else. When it comes to me setting up the question, it is complicated, unfortunately, and this is where one of the questions I see on the forum is that how much time does it take? And yes, it takes an awful lot of time. So here I'm using random variables, and in the question variables, that's where you set up your question. And you do some of your calculations in here, and you end up defining variables. It's using a computer algebra system here to interpret these. It uses colon for assignment rather than the equal sign. Every line has to end in a semicolon. It's very strict syntax and it gets painful. And then you have to formulate your question. And in here again, there are some rules. This is actually the bottom half. So when I scroll up to the top half, you can see I'm writing it in here, and then I'm putting in the variable names, and this brackets at says use the value for the variable rather than the variable name itself. Otherwise, it will use a LaTeX type interpreter to display it as an equation. And then we have elements here where we control how the input looks to the student and what tests might be done on that input to make sure it's the right part. The real interest here, though, comes when we look at the response. So this is where the answer the student has been typed in is evaluated. And we can have multiple values in here, multiple assessments that go on. And each one of these nodes is a different assessment. It can check how close it is. If we're looking for relative numbers, you can look at absolute numbers. You can look at algebraic inputs and whether they've input an equation that matches or they've manipulated an equation. And there are a whole variety of tests that are built into this. It takes a while to learn, and I can't claim to be an expert in all of them yet, or anywhere near that. The other thing we can do is in here, we can have further calculations that weren't done initially. So you can see that one there used as the student's answer 3 before this was evaluated. So answer 4 could depend on what the student put in for answer 3, and we can evaluate the student's answer against follow-on calculations, but based on wrong data going into them. Still give them scores for the follow-on calculation if they've done that right, but deduct marks for the previous calculation that was incorrect. Inside as well, with the green and the red boxes, we can put in feedback that could be used directly for the students. And that could be given back to them during a formative assessment. And then ultimately, we can kill all that off in terms of feedback for an online exam, so that they don't get any feedback during the exam as to the quality of their answers. But this allows us to evaluate 6 or 7, as many inputs as we like, and a student working through a problem in a guided mode. Sorry, I've skipped on too much there, but that's just the text there, so that will be in the slides for somebody to look at if they want to see how the question is posed. But in the middle of that, we've got some LaTeX here, which displays the equations nicely in the mathematical format that they need as we come down through it. For the first years in their exam, rather than ask them to complete what would have been a single calculation, I tended to break things down and put some guiding of the students through them, but hopefully not having too much guidance in there. But also what I was getting to do in this one was to insert, so you can see, start at the beginning. I got them to do a quick analysis of the overall problem and come up with the force here at A, the external force on the system. Then a free body diagram, as I would have done with the method of sections, and allowing them then to have some variables names, and then put in equations based on that. So they had to fill in the correct variable names with the correct plus and minuses, with the sines and cosines of the different angles as needs be in here based on the geometry they had above, and then provide the solutions. So in this way, I get a nuanced evaluation of the student. And as Stephen mentioned there earlier, the advantage of this as well is when we go back, sorry, these are some of the inputs and how they might be presented back to the students. And as Stephen was saying, we end up with a good trace of this, so we can see exactly what the student was presented with at an individual level, and we can check that back against how the student actually performed. The other advantage I found with this was, while the questions were difficult and challenging to set up, that once the students had found innovative ways to answer them, that in a real kind of paper exam marking, I would have thought that would be good. It's not what I had intended them to do, but actually that's a valid way to approach this problem and give them some marks for it. I was able to go back after the exam had closed and change how the system evaluated the answers. And the result of that was that I was able to make sure that the students got marks where they needed to get marks. So what we have here is that I've got open problem questions that can be posed using open source tools. So we haven't paid, DCU hasn't paid for this. It does require a lot more preparation than just setting up a problem as you would on paper. to think about how do you extract the information about progress through the solution from the students. Sometimes you have to train the solutions in how to enter the information. But you can use the same questions with different quiz settings for formative or summative assessment. And what I feel in terms of preventing the students collaborating or colluding with each other to cheat on the system is that they each get their own random version of the question. So the question looks the same, but they all get different numbers and have different calculations to do. So the chances of them being able to collaborate with each other is difficult. And the other one is that if this is synchronous and it is all time-based and they're pressurized for time, then the chance of them being able to help each other out drops again. It's not perfect and it's improving all the time. There's some reference materials, so those will be available, and if they're sending out the original PowerPoints, I'll update the PowerPoints that I've got because these links are better than before. Chris Sanguin is the inventor, well, the originator of this. It's now developed by more than him, but he has a good book on what he's doing there. You can download it or get it online from that last link. There's some case studies which are useful to look at, and it's a PDF document. And then there's online publications as well, but definitely well worth investigating at least. So thank you very much for your time, and I'll see what comes up in the questions later on.
Paul, thank you so much for that. Very, very interesting, and thanks for sharing so much with everybody here. And I'm sure there will be a few questions. I see a few coming in already. So just to remind people, any questions you have to pop them into the Q&A section there, and we'll handle them in the discussion afterwards. So last but not least, our final speaker is Brian Call, who's a lecturer in the Faculty of Engineering and Design at the Institute of Technology Sligo, which is Ireland's largest provider of online education in the third level sector. Brian lectures primarily to online students and is currently delivering a massive open online course on Lean Six Sigma to over 2,000 students. Brian was recognised for his work in this area by being awarded an Irish National Teaching Expert Award by the National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning in Higher Education. Brian, you're most welcome to give your presentation on how students cheat, designing your assessments to reduce plagiarism, collusion and copying.
Thank you, Una. So yes, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to talk about how students cheat, and that's the first half of my presentation because I don't have all the answers. And then the second half is going to be some strategies to reduce or prevent that. But if you think that writing on your hand is what students are doing nowadays, well, stay awake. So in a survey, about 70,000 students were surveyed in the US, and 2/3 of them said they cheated. Now, what does cheating mean? It could be collusion, it could be copying, and it could be right through to getting somebody else to do the study. But we'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about strategies to avoid. So I noticed, I was visiting my nephew. He's about 11 years old, or 12, I think, and he was doing his homework, and he had a look. He got a question, which I'll see. Can I play back here? And he got Alexa to answer it.
Alexa, is 1009 a prime number?
Yes, 1009 is a prime number.
So that's just the start of it. I mean, he could use it for spelling. Now, his mother, my sister, said you had to turn off Alexa. But I mean, this is, I went online and there's t-shirts now saying, Alexa, do my homework. But from calculation to translation and only getting better all of the time.
Alexa, is one...
If we look at homework help, we've got a lot of different ones. We got Course Hero, we got Chegg. They will give you course notes. You can probably go on there and you can find your own course notes. They'll give you exam questions. They'll give you sample solutions. I mean, they have 100 million in revenue, and about 10 million members accessing their online resources, which are uploaded by students, but some would say some professors, lecturers are uploading as well. I think there's some kind of credit system whereby if you upload, you get credit to look at other stuff. So I doubt it's just students using it. And then academic writing services, if you look at these, I mean, this used to be just a paper that they would do. There's stories of essay mills in Kenya in particular being a popular location. The writers get about $2 to $5 a page. They'll write on anything. You give it to them, they'll write on anything. You can see here, you calculate the price. You can click on college and probably your own college will drop down. Maybe even your own course might be in a drop-down list now. Essay, what type do you want? Do you want a thesis? When do you want it? And how many pages do you want? You can see one page there is about $14, but if you're doing number of pages, it can drop down to about maybe $4 a page. So if you think a 3,000 word essay, maybe 10 pages, $40, yeah, it probably makes a lot of sense. And then right through then to websites such as this one called noneedtostudy.com. There's all sorts of names, but they will actually take your entire online course for you. So you just give them your login details and your credit card details, and they will take the online course for you. And there was a few years ago, probably in the last 2 years, in a university in the US, the professors doubted that this could be possible. So Western Carolina University, and you can read online about this case study, they put Joey Sanchez, fictitious name, in a class, but they actually told the professor, we've got a guy in your class taking your assessments right through. So he had the login details and there was a number of assessments right throughout the semester, and they couldn't find him. They couldn't find him in the class. They thought they could, but they couldn't locate him. And Joey did very well. I think some of them even give you, if you know, you get guaranteed an A or your money back. And then PhotoMath, this has been downloaded about 100 million times. I have a short video here, which again, hopefully it'll play back okay. And I'll give you an idea of some of the types of questions. It's an app for your phone that can be answered.
Learning any new subject can be challenging. For many students, that subject is math. Fortunately, PhotoMath is here to help. PhotoMath is a new app that not only solves complex math equations, but teaches you how to solve them yourself. It uses your phone's camera to scan the math equation. Within seconds, it spits out the answer. Tap the answer bar to reveal the step-by-step instructions on how to get the solution.
Okay, so you can see there that it'll even give you the step-by-step instructions, and it even does handwriting now. So you can have a handwritten and it'll scan it. And they say they solve about 1 billion monthly maths problems. So quite unlikely that some of your students aren't using it. Right, so let's now talk then about how some strategies to prevent cheating. And I think at the top level, you've got to have a really strong academic integrity policy. But I think really cheating to a student, they don't really see it as being wrong in a lot of cases. It depends on what level. Obviously, Joey Sanchez, yeah, I think, but getting a little bit of help or asking a friend, I mean, that's what they probably do in the workplace anyway. But essentially, I would equate it maybe to speeding. You know, we've probably no one on this webinar today hasn't broken the speed limit. But really, you ask yourself two questions. What are the chances of getting caught? And what's the penalty if I do get caught? And I think if you look in Irish universities and colleges, probably the answer to the first one is really low. And the answer then, the follow on is, what's the penalties? Well, I've seen some of the policies from different colleges, and it can start off with a slap on the wrist. You'd really want to be a serial offender. But essentially, there's no correlation. There was a report in the Irish Times. There's absolutely no correlation between the number of students who say they cheat versus the academic integrity, you know, actions that are taken. So you would expect, let's say, only 10% of the students cheat, even or 5%. So in an average Irish college, you would expect 500 people, if they were caught, to be brought before the disciplinary committee. But I know it's probably in single digits in most colleges. So that's the first place. I think you've really got to answer those two questions. Online proctored exams probably is the gold standard at the moment now. So here's a company, they've invented it. They mail this out to you. It's got a 360-degree camera you put on your head. Another where you log in, you show your ID card, and you're just monitored the whole time. So I think there is going to be a role for these more and more so, particularly for high stakes exams and maybe final year exams. For written assignments, turn it in. Some of the previous speakers talked about that. But I think turn it in is really only an output. And I assist some lecturers in IT Sligo. They come to me in May and go, I think this guy's plagiarized, but the exam board's tomorrow. And, so I really think, okay, what are you going to do with a turn it in report a couple of days beforehand? So you've really got to use it earlier in the semester. But what I found is what really works well is to stop people getting their assignments done by someone else is that you would specify the inputs to the assignment. So all references must be from the college library databases. It's really hard for the guys in Kenya to get into the IT Sligo databases and figure out if the references from there. Or all references used must be from the last 5 years. And if you're not happy with all, it could be 80%. You could also ask them to upload a separate table. So for example, I know in the quality space, Emerald or Science Direct will give me anything I need. And if a student wants to use a different reference, then so be it. But you can, even though they're turning in free, these assignments, you can really recognize them. They have really obscure papers and references. So this has worked really well for me. And then equally getting the students to upload the references, where they're located and what the search term was, and then downloading each of these as a PDF file. If you download from the Emerald database, it'll actually time and date stamp it with your institution's logo. So again, it's like trying to stop someone maybe breaking into your house. You're not going to stop them if they want to get in, but it's going to make it a lot harder. For online quizzes, maths and science, I mean, we've had Louise and Paul there talk, give some great ideas. What I would say is use a large question bank, but don't be surprised. Professors in the US have found students had 500 of their questions printed out and they went from year to year. Set up your quiz, use randomized question order. MCQs, they're pretty much easily defeated. I mean, I attended a conference there a few years ago where they said, usually the longest answer is the right one because that's the one that the professor has to get right. And there's a few different strategies for that. The time limit, 1 hour or whatever, fixed. Fixed day and time, which I think Paul said they used or Stephen said they used in the OU. That works well. Very simple in Moodle, use sequential rather than free format. This means that the student must answer the question before they proceed to the next one. It stops them WhatsApping the questions around to their friends. So that's just a default setting you can put up on Moodle. Use randomized variables, as you can see here in Whereas, but equally numbers or Brightspace. Any randomized variables, we use Whereas in IT Sligo. Again, to stop photo math, I would use a text-based questions to disguise the underlying maths equations required. So you might say, what are the 5 numbers that you might use to describe descriptive statistics on this data set? And you could also, I think, what I think Louise said is have the student upload their workings. Okay, so that's it. I'll be happy to take questions at the end, like everybody else. So,
okay, thanks very much, Brian. I'm just going to share my own screen here. Okay, so thanks, Brian. That was rather eye-opening, to say the least. We're going to move on to our questions and answers. I think some of them have already been answered in the discussion panel. We're going to go ahead and see what we've got. Okay, so our first one is, has anyone estimated the workload in building multiple choice quizzes? And do you have any tips on reducing this workload, for example, editing in Word and importing? It's a general question to the full panel, but it was asked during Louise's presentation.
Extremely time consuming.
Yeah.
It's helpful if you design in such a way that you are building a question bank that you can use for either formative or CA down the line, which is kind of what I did. I built the questions on the basis that I could use them for the CA down the line, so that I wouldn't have to recreate something. So if you can use it again when we go back to normal, in quotation marks, then hopefully. But yeah, it is quite time consuming, and a lot of people, a lot of my colleagues have a bank of papers that they've used over the years, and they generally just take from that, or they kind of maybe just make small modifications every year. Yeah, this is extremely time consuming. I think it took me and another colleague who were building quizzes about a week to create one exam back in May. So yeah, a lot longer than normal. Normal would be about a day to create a paper and its solution.
Okay, thanks, Louise. I think probably from what I've heard from other lecturers, it's most worth your time if you plan on reusing them again in the years to come. So even
Absolutely.
as practice exam papers in the years to come afterwards, then in a week or so going into it might be worth it.
I think I would agree with that. That it's the reuse of the questions afterwards is really where the time spent developing them is going to come back to you.
Yeah, the value comes back. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's see. What about students explaining how they arrived at an answer? I think that's probably been partly answered by the presentations that followed.
I think Photomath will do that for you anyway.
Yeah, I've considered that as well for some of my structural analysis problems. I normally ask them to draw what's called a bend and moment diagram, so how the structure behaves. Any software, any structural design software will do this for you in minutes. Yes, it'll be more time consuming for them to build it in the software, but they still can do it. Whereas it was suggested to me that maybe asking them to describe how they came to draw the bend and moment diagram, because there's a process. You have to you have to think about it and how the structure behaves, and only then can you draw it. So there is a way of doing that in some instances, but yeah, again, as Brian was saying, it depends on the thing, but on what's out there and what type of question you're asking.
Yeah, and how to break up your marks to assign marks to each portion of the explanation as well, just adding more work. Okay, this one is for Louise and Paul. The constructed online quizzes are a good response to the current situation, and I think also good formative assessment tools. However, they do not appear to me to replicate real-world problem solving, in that students appear to be more guided through the problem than they would be in reality. So what are your views on this?
I think that's a fair comment.
Absolutely.
But I think we have to look at what we're actually trying to get the students to do in a situation like this, and set the questions that way, that maybe those more open real-world problem-solving activities are much more assignment and give the students time, and sometimes to do them in groups rather than individually. You know, and I thought Louisa's video assignments looked like they were quite good for that, addressing those kind of things where you're giving them a completely free challenge. And the other element at the back of my mind at the moment as well, the way that we were, certainly I was, it's a long time ago now when I was doing my undergraduate engineering exams, but what we needed to know at that point in time, given the resources available to us, is very different from what a student needs to know now, given the resources available to them. And we need to make sure that we're examining the right things. And it's not necessarily exactly the same things that we were examined on. So it's all developing all the time, and we just need to be careful that we're asking the students the right questions. You know, that the tools that Brian was talking about there, we can say they're all dreadful, and you can go back far enough when you get the Greek philosophers who thought that writing was a dreadful thing, because nobody had to remember what the answers were anymore. You could write it down and read it later. So we have to figure out, based on the technology that's available now and the tools that they have and the world that we're equipping the students for, how do we need to ask them questions to demonstrate that they know enough to be engineers?
That's true, and that's true outside of remote assessment as well. That goes forward to all years, I suspect.
In addition to that, Amy, the only thing I'd add is when we're dealing with open book exams, they have the procedure in front of them to a certain degree anyway, because they're going to have past questions that they've worked on. So kind of guiding them through where to answer and how to answer, if it's an open book exam, isn't a real issue. It's you know, just because they already have the information there in front of them.
That's true. Okay, now we have another question here from Brian. Has the initiative of the National Academic Integrity Network had any impact on student culture, attitudes towards cheating? So that would be probably most directed towards Brian, I would imagine.
Yeah, an interesting question. I mean, I think there is a cultural issue there insofar as if I use, again, the analogy around speeding or drink driving. But a lot of those still came down to enforcement. And for example, there was a study done in the UK where they looked at Turnitin and they looked at the similarity indexes. So every college in the country that uses Turnitin has a similarity index for their college. In other words, of the papers that went through, what was the similarity on average or the max or min? So you could say, for example, of the 10,000 papers submitted in College X, 1,000 of them had an 80% similarity. And then they correlated that with the actual enforcement. It said, well, how many disciplinary issues were raised against this? And it was very low. There was no correlation. And I haven't seen that type of work. And you might say, oh, we've got to be nice to them and so on, but it hasn't worked in 20 years. So I think there's a balance there. And I haven't seen that type of analysis being done through the network, through QQI. I have responded to some of their surveys and suggested stuff like this, but I haven't seen that analysis. And I think that it's got to start there. So I think the attitude is, if I can get away with it, I will. And if my colleague isn't getting caught, then then shame on us. We should be the referees. So if half the class are getting away with it and getting A's, and the guys who do it themselves get C's and D's, then I think we need to take a role there.
Indeed. Okay, we have another question from Eleanor. I allow students to use Turnitin and PhotoMath to check their own work before submitting their final draft. Knowing that students use these tools is important. Also, has anyone heard of students putting essays through Google Translate into another language and then translating back to English again? I guess that's probably just a general comment, and then I suppose a question to the entire group if anyone's heard of that Google Translate being used before.
I have heard it as a way to fight to beat the plagiarism checkers. But I haven't actually had a situation of where I think it's been done.
I'm not sure the quality you'd be getting back if you're translating over.
Absolutely.
There have been reports of theses being submitted in another language, so say Polish or whatever, and then translate into English and then turn it in, or we'll never find that. So there have been reports using it that way. But I'm sure every student taking a language class uses Google Translate to help them in some ways. And Turnitin, using it to check their own work, I do have an issue with that, because what's happening is students can buy a Turnitin report or an essay, and then they get a free go at Turnitin before they submit it. So it pretty much guarantees to them that what they bought is Turnitin free. So I would never allow them to use Turnitin for the full submission, maybe for one chapter.
Okay.
Yeah, the scariest one that I've seen is somebody took a document in Word and inserted non-printing characters in between instead of all the spaces, and then created the PDF and sent that in. to turn it in, and of course it didn't find anything because it was all one long word.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, it's almost, you should get points for the ingenuity.
Well, I've often thought that they should get marks based on the quality of the source of the plagiarism article.
What about the issue of impersonation? Time pressure is fine, but can you be sure that the student is doing the exam and not someone else? And presumably that's without having proctoring. That's a general question to the panel. If anyone has any suggestions.
I don't think, I think you've got to put as many barriers in the way. In fact, a lot of the people who buy the essay, I mean, they won't take a live assessment for you, quite clearly. So I think you've got to put a number of different barriers in the way, or as I said, fixed time is really difficult for them. And, you know, if someone's helping them out in the workplace, they might help them 1 week with a question with their, or one of their colleagues, but they're not going to help them every week if you have regular, frequent, low stakes assessments. So I think it's a number of different strategies. If you have one high stakes exam at the end that isn't proctored, then yeah, I think you're in trouble.
Right. Can you please ask the speakers for their view of formative assessment? Can it be worth marks, or is it only for student feedback? A lot of online quizzes or tests can easily be created for formative assessment. However, students are more motivated to complete them when there are marks involved. I can probably start with what my approach is for that. I have one subject that has a good bit of formative assessment in it, and I don't assign marks to it as that's not part of a formative assessment, but I tell them that I won't mark the marked assessment unless they have completed the formative assessment. So they may not care as much about how well they do in it, but they at least have to complete it in order to get any mark for the year.
Yes.
If anyone else has any approach?
Yes, Amy, we find at the OU that if assessments are purely formative, a lot of the students won't do them. So we have a sort of hybrid system where the marks don't count to their final grading, but they still have to do the assessment.
Good. Yes, exactly. Yeah. I think that's the only way of doing it, since you can't give them marks, and just to ensure that they actually complete it.
Yeah, I've sometimes used it to gate their access to things that they do get marked for, which makes them do it. The other thing is, sometimes I might give them marks for formative assessment, but there's so few marks they don't make any difference at the end of the day. What I found is that students will do anything for marks. It doesn't matter how few marks are going for an activity. So even if it's only worth 0.1%, they want to do it if they think there's marks associated with it.
I agree, Paul. And I'm far more open to giving minor marks to something for formative assessment as opposed to marks for participation or attendance. I want them to at least submit what they did in the tutorial, even, and to get the marks, as opposed to sit in the room and fall asleep. So obviously that's just based on trying to get that idea of that formative assessment. If there was marks that you wanted to give little marks, I'd be giving it to formative assessment over attendance.
Okay, we'll take one last question. This is from Eleanor. How are dyslexic students supported during online exams? This has been partly answered already in the discussion, but maybe if we open up to all the panelists. What's your experience with dyslexic students and online exams? Maybe no one has any experience.
The only thing that I know of, and we can do this with the quizzes, is we can allow them extra time where needed. And that can be done certainly in Moodle. It can be done on an individual basis, so that it's not every student gets the extra time. So what DCU did was they have a register of all the students who are qualified for extra time, and they were automatically awarded whatever extra time they were due for the simultaneous online timed assessments.
Judge, in our own school, that's exactly what we have come across as well. I don't think anyone has found that there is a particular difference between dyslexic and non-dyslexic submissions, but as well, we would be obviously giving them the extra time. Okay, I'm going to wrap up the question and answer session there, and I'm just going to give you an introduction to our next webinar, which will be on the 18th of February. This is looking into the introduction of sustainable development goals into engineering programs, and they're also planning to publish a brochure of graphical abstracts related to this topic. So if you'd like your graphical abstract to be considered for inclusion, you'll need to submit this by the end of January. And there'll be plenty more information on this webinar in the coming weeks. So just lastly then, I'll leave up everybody's contact details there. On behalf of the Engineers Ireland Academic Society, I'd like to express our thanks to today's speakers for taking the time out of your very busy schedules to provide us with such insightful and very timely information today. I'd like to thank Maureen, especially from Engineers Ireland, for hosting and moderating the event. And a thank you to the Academic Society's subcommittee, Una, Anne, and Pat, for helping me organise today's event. A special thanks as well to all of our attendees today. We really hope to see you at the next webinar and all of our webinars to come.